what it is we do, and I'd simply like to play the violin better. And I'd like to be more involved in how that happens, and the culture which produces it, and the culture to which music contributes a very small part. I think one of the really exciting things about being in the arts is not that the arts are the most important thing, but the arts, if you like, contribute this extraordinary tiny thing which can have enormous impact. You know, I'm just a violinist. I just have 4 strings, but I've seen what a great work, or even a very slight work written for violin, can achieve, and for the human experience, and for me selfishly. So, just to begin, I would like to just start with why it is I do this. Just literally 2 minutes of a violin concerto, which, yeah, I am playing it, but what is going on is absolutely nothing to do with me, because this is a live performance recorded in Germany with the composer who is sitting so close to me that he didn't realize that all the way through the concerto he was doing that. So I was playing here, the mic was there, the conductor was there, and he was there. Which means that this was not my performance, but this, if there's 2 minutes of music that illustrates why I love collaborating with composers, this would do it. So, for me, beginnings with this man. When I was 19, I was a little astonished to find that the man whose idea it was that Alban Berg should write a violin concerto was alive and teaching. And this was the man who not only premiered the violin concerto on the first day of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, famously conducted by Hermann Scherchen after Webern had run for the hills after not managing to rehearse more than 5 pages of it, but then a few weeks later gave the amazing performance of the same work with Webern conducting the BBC Symphony Orchestra, which perhaps is the most exciting performance ever by a big British orchestra. I challenge you to hear anything more extraordinary than this. So I wrote to Lewis and said, you know, I'm a violinist and I'm studying the Berg and cello concertos, and he said, come. So I went to Boston in a very, very hot summer, and I was in his studio NEC, and at the end of quite some time of daily lessons which lasted 6 hours, he looked up at me and he said, my fee's $100 an hour. This was 1988, so I have to just promise me you do this for somebody else in 60 years' time. And that was the end of our collaboration. But when he died, I was astonished to discover that in the library at Harvard, there is a box of our correspondence, which he'd saved, and it was catalogued. And that, to me, was the most amazing tribute. He described the moment, which he told the story many times, but him telling it to me while studying this incredible work, of arriving for the first time to Berg's apartment to start working on the piece with Berg. And he came in and Berg said, oh, spielen, play. And we went off down the end of the apartment, and Berg started making coffee, and he started playing the Beethoven concerto. And this shout came from the other end of the apartment, nein, kein Concerto, no concertos. So he said, I started playing Bach. And then, kein Bach, not noodle, improvisieren. So he stood there for hours and just improvised. And then he said later, when material started to arrive from Berg, he recognized bits of what had found its way from that improvising. And I was already collaborating at some degree with composers at that point, but at that moment I thought, that is it. I want that. That will do, just to be there. And I was very lucky because a few months earlier, I had met and started working with Hans Werner Henze. And this was, I wanted to bring this in here because I wanted to make one point, which is, in order to understand how collaboration works today and how it's worked historically, we need to get away from the idea that collaboration is always easy or comfortable. Hensar was, I loved the man dearly. He was an incredible influence to me. There's no musician who's more important to me, yet he was one of the most difficult people I ever knew. When I was 23, we had an absolutely epic row, and we didn't speak for 5 years. But the thing he gave me, and this is, in all the time we worked together, I worked on him, my ensemble worked on his opera with him, I played his concertos with him conducting. In fact, recording we released just after he died was the very last time he ever conducted, was conducting me doing his second violin concerto. That was his last time on the podium. And I hadn't listened to the recording until he died, and then realized I'd been part of something, again, which was beyond me. This is a bit of a letter that he wrote me in 1991 with a piece he wrote for me called Fünf Nachtstücke, which was probably the first time an older composer had written a piece for me, and it was this kind of awful moment of the score arriving and realizing I'd asked for a tiny piece for my kind of personal debut. I thought I was going to get a 2-minute thing, and I got a masterpiece. It's, I'm going to say it, the greatest work of that type to be written for violin and piano since the Weber 4 pieces. I'm sorry, fight me over that. It is. Absolutely extraordinary. And you're thinking, how do I come up to this? And he sent me a letter. Maybe you want to put in special effects like sol taster, sol ponticello, and what have you. Do go ahead and use the material you consider the best, which means the most effective, to bring out the meaning of the whole thing. Looking forward to hearing it. And that was the beginning of our workshops. It's something which Stravinsky called the passport. The idea that a composer would say to a player, I'm trusting you to do the best thing with this. And all the time we're working with Hensar, the one thing we never argued about, in fact, he never told me how to play his music once. It was more that he opened a space in which the music could happen. And before I go on, I want to say one thing which I think is really important, because there will be people here who are not interested in new music. I have premiered over 400 works. I'm not interested in being a new music specialist. I don't think it's helpful. Every time I've worked with a living composer, it has given me material to understand the collaborative processes which are responsible for nearly all music making in the past. And every time I've worked with a dead composer, the reverse is true. And now some of those are going to appear today. For me, I want to get behind the workshop door. I want to work out how things happen, if you like. The piece I played you earlier was from George Rochberg's violin concerto. What was very interesting about working with him, and some of you may have this experience, is the experience of working with a composer who stopped writing. So I met George Rochberg 6 years before he died, which was almost 5 years after he'd stopped composing. Because he stopped composing at a certain age, he decided he was written out. So all the work that we did was on either pre-existing material and fighting a great deal about how his music should work. And one thing, I wanted to put this picture up of my then 4-year-old son with George in Philadelphia, is for me, when music works, it needs to be absolutely part of my life. I know there are some people for whom music is a profession, and it happens in studios and it happens in official places. For me, the most exciting music making happens when composers come and they hang out in my house, and we sit on the sofa and we talk about things, and there's musicking and there's dinner and there's conversation. And my son was lucky or not lucky to be part of this, and that I kind of sums up, it almost feels a little bit like what it felt like to work with somebody like that. I'm just beginning with some older composers, because these were people who influenced me when I was younger, and also because I think it's worth saying something which cannot be said enough now, which, I don't want that to do that, don't play, behave, which is, I was lucky, I started when I was very young with people who were much, much older than me, and for me there is this extraordinary thing that comes from working with a mind which has all of this experience. I don't understand why we as a culture and as an artist don't seek out what old people are doing, because that's where the technique and the dreaming is one. And my experience is, all of these older people is that absolutely amazing things have come from it. I put up Peter Dickinson there because although he and I met when I was a teenager and I played some of his music, I played for a birthday concert of his, we didn't actually start to work seriously together until about 2005, and it was a really bizarre experience. He said, I want to rewrite my first string quartet. I said, when did you write your first string quartet? On 1961. So we worked on a rewrite of the string quartet. Now this was absolutely extraordinary, and we realized, and of course it's obvious, just because he'd written it 5 or 6 years before I was born, didn't mean that he felt it was old material. As far as he was concerned, he was working on new material. That was, I think, for me and my colleagues in the string quartet, in the Kreutzer quartet, that was an amazing, it should have been obvious, but it really was a revelation to realize what happens when a composer digs back into their material. There is a question, interesting ethical question of ownership here, because a number of the composers, and they're not going to be named today, have, sometimes there is a question of when you've started a piece of music and then a composer goes into it, whose land is it? With Hensar, for instance, I had an interesting experience after we had our reconciliation, where he said, I want you to play my solo sonata, which had not been written for me. He said, I want you to play it in Madrid, go over here. And he said, I'll send you my revised version. I said, what revised version? So this thing came, and there were all of these bits of paper taped all over the bits, all over it. He's dead, so he can't stop me saying this now. It was just like somebody had gone through a photo album where they were wearing flares, and they covered up all the bits of the embarrassing clothes, because all the kind of edgy 70s stuff had been edited out. And I said, I'm not doing that. And I said, I also learned the original. He said, we do a deal. He said, while I'm alive, you play this version, but when I die, you can play the older version. So we did that. So I made a recording for, the first recording I did of the original version, which is a Natsos version. I did the revised version, and shortly after he died, released the unrevised version, which he'd given me permission to do that, and he couldn't stop me anyway. But that is worth saying. And this has been a little bit in the ether today, when there is a workshop environment, there is a question, because people both put work into something as to, yes, composers own their work, but the interesting thing is that it's gone into the marrow, the bones of the people who've been there as well. One composer who's on this list today wrote a violin concerto for me, which was played, and we played it in Denmark, and we recorded it, and then I said I wanted to stream it. He said, oh no, I've withdrawn that piece. I said, that's like 25,000 notes you've just withdrawn. Can I have them back, please? But I know it's a silly thing to say, but it's just worth putting out there. I wanted to include Gloria Coates, because she is one of the composers who's been one of my oldest friends and who I've worked with the longest. We met after I made the mistake of going into a violin competition in Germany, from which I was removed at some speed, and we met. I was invited to a party in Munich, and someone said, oh, I live next door to an artist. You're an artist. And Gloria was brought into the room. At that point, she was completely unknown. She'd had works played in the mid-70s by the Kronos Quartet when they were just founded, and for various reasons, that had ended. And so I realized this was somebody who's, both in terms of their work as an artist and their work as a composer, was going to be fundamental to what I did. So I started the business of, and it was a hard sell, trying to persuade my colleagues to play this music. Now, by now, we're down the line, and we've recorded 6 discs of the music for Naxos, and the only reason they did that was that we did it for nothing, and then they became a bestseller, so they couldn't stop it, so they actually had to make a box set, having said nobody would listen to it. And I've experienced a situation in recent years where musicians will recommend her music to me who 20 years ago told me that it was derivative rubbish. That I regard as a mark of success, the fact that you managed to... Gloria is one of the few composers whose music is absolutely recognizable from the first second. You have no question who you're listening to, and you either love it or you absolutely detest it. My father can't be in the same room at the same time the music is going on, but it's an amazing thing to be around, and I mentioned this because of the idea of how do we listen? When you work with the composer, there are various responses you'll find when you're playing their music in a workshop situation or in a concert situation. There are some who are the score checkers, and they'll sit there and it's just almost ticking things off, and then you'll get a list. That's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. And there are some who will have lots of questions. Gloria never brings a score to a rehearsal ever. She will sit down, maybe, so she'll be sitting there, and if you play a piece through, she'll sit with her head in her hands the whole way through. Won't come out from this look of apparently complete existential despair until the end, and then she'll look up and she'll say, "Do you think it works?" And the first time she did that, I thought, what on earth are you talking about? I thought, that is the question. It is the only question. Does it work? This thing from A, you're getting from A to B or A to C, whatever it is the art of it, is it effective? What can we do to make it a powerful spiritual and audio experience? So with Gloria, that's what we work on. Her music is almost entirely contrapuntal glissando with no nodal landings. So it does require quite a degree of forbearance to play. It's physically painful to play. But the players who choose to do it, it's very, very moving. That's her in her apartment in Munich, and those are her paintings on the walls. And the interesting thing is, both of us are both visual artists, and she vigorously resists the idea there's any link between her painting and her music. I love it. Anybody can see that they're coming from the same place, but no, it's not linked. And I won't have that argument with her. That one there hangs on my wall. I see that painting every day. So, in fact, quite a few of the composers, if you come to my apartment, there are paintings by composers' wives, there's manuscripts framed on the wall. As you can see, I absolutely love music manuscript. Because that's one of the things which also is central to this, is how do the composers communicate directly with us? And this is where I'm going to make myself extremely unpopular, which is, I think a huge amount has been lost since all of you started either using Finale or Sibelius. I mean, it's now in a situation where 95% of pieces that come are in that format, and I would say that about 10% of them have been directly influenced in their content by the program which is being written on. I mean, and that is a problem. Here is one of my all-time favorite. This is actually technically the manuscript. This is the first of Jörg Widmann's Etudes for solo violin, which is now quite a big series. Jörg and I met each other when he would have been 17, I was 20. We met in Italy, and we found we had no common languages at all. I had Italian and French and English, and he had German and nothing else apart from that part at that point. And we sat on a bench outside somewhere in don't know where we were, and sang Schumann at each other. That was how we got to know each other. And we didn't see each other until about 3 years later. I was giving a concert in London, and the door opened to the green room in the interval, and suddenly the same young guy burst in all kind of full of energy. "I'm so glad to see you. It's been so long, I've been thinking about working together." I said, "Oh, how do I get rid of him?" I said, "Go away and write me a piece," thinking that would do it. Right. And 6 months later, I was giving a concert in Munich. He said, "Here's your piece." And that was the sort of the beginning of the working relationship. Again, this is almost linked to the Hensar thing. For those of you who are collaborators, working relationships, collaborations are not consistent. So Jörg and I are friends now, but our period of intense collaboration lasted for about a decade, and then he went somewhere else. I don't want to say this is the same as Joachim getting involved in Amelie Schneeweiss's divorce case against Brahms, but it's worth saying that, like a relationship, if a collaboration means anything, there will be dips and yaws in it. There's got to be energy in it. Otherwise, it's just going to be like, I don't know, milk and water. I wanted to bring this up because one of the questions I think I don't want to play, important is getting through the door. I think for this building, there's very few composers who are more important than dear John. And I was very privileged. Linda Merrickers at the back there was the person who gave me the opportunity to premiere John's clarinet quintet in All Around the Corner. Now, the really interesting thing about John, and we all know there were very few people who were more precise about their scores than this man, was that the workshop door, and this is what we're partially talking about with John, was closed. If you were to draw a line of composers who let you into the process to those who don't, you'd have John at one end over there, and if you give an extreme example, someone like Nigel Clark on the other end there. Nigel and I sit down and we say, what are we going to do? And he's got a blank sheet of paper, and I say, well, you want me to do it? With John, you get the score. I remember with one of the proudest moments was in all of playing and recording John's music, and also working with him on other, he very much encouraged me to take his teacher Alan Roth's music very seriously. And that's an important thing. How do composers point to other composers is a vital part of the collaboration. In all of those times, I found one semiquaver wrong in the McCabe score. One. And this was like this great epic moment, because there was an incredible Spartan rigor to what he did. This was a concert which we gave, which there's back there, in St John's Waterloo, not long before John died. And he came there on the bus. I've never forgotten that. He came on the bus. And I just love this kind of spirit of loving music. But that didn't mean that it wasn't a collaboration. The collaboration was elsewhere. The collaboration was in the letters, the beautiful letters talking about other music, about things you wanted to do, discussions, talking about history. That had its impact on the process. Still sticking with older composers, not so well known in the UK. I met Elliot Schwartz when I was in my late teens, and then was reintroduced to him in my mid-20s by Michael Tippett's amanuensis, Marion Bowen. What I loved about Elliot, who died 5 years ago, was that Elliot was somebody who insisted on living totally in the now. Shortly after the launch of Facebook, he wrote a music theatre piece entirely based on stuff he'd culled from people's posts. It was called The Facebook Opera. And it's brilliant. I mean, it's designed so that you put it together each time using new material from the posts. And this was our last collaboration. And there's nothing maudlin about this. This was 2 weeks before he died, and he was so pleased that he could come to the concert on a tablet. This was, he thought was absolutely marvellous. He thought it was hilarious that he was being handed around on a tablet from his nursing. He thought this was absolutely fantastic. Now, one thing I got from Elliot was he was one of the people who was most excited about questions of notation. Some of you may know his very interesting book called Music Since 1945, which is a lovely kind of exploration of sort of the second half of the 20th century. But Elliot had a very interesting way of composing, which some people really hated, which was that Elliot was the only composer I ever met who never revised. So Elliot actually did write pieces A to B, B to C, C to D. Every page, because he used a mixture of space-time and notation, every page was exactly 45 seconds long. Always 45 seconds long, just as much as a film script. You know, it was absolutely like that. And he believes very passionately that the act of composing was directly analogous to the act of performing. Effectively, the composition itself was a performance. And he actually believed in a non-take two-ness in composition, that if you messed up, then you're going to write another piece. This could have incredibly good results, and sometimes it didn't work at all. But what's interesting, of course, is naturally he was a composer who was tended to use a lot of other layered materials. And one of the things I treasure the most was I commissioned a piece for him, which we actually premiered back at London College of Music, which a piece of string orchestra called Water Music. And in it, it had references to lots of other water musics, including Chopin's Raindrop Prelude. And I said, look, I need an original recording of this. I do not want to be sued by a pianist every time we play it with the tape, because I had rain and everything. I said, just go and record it on your piano. He lived in Maine. So he sent me this recording, and I treasure that recording. It's everyone knows what I'm talking about. When even if a composer doesn't have the world's best technique, sometimes when a composer puts their hands on the music of another composer, there's a transcendence there. I think it's one of the most beautiful Raindrops preludes I know. So officially this disc is supposed to be the disc which goes with performing this piece, but it sits on my pile of CDs in my room. I know I can put it on, and Elliot is back in the room, which I absolutely love. And this is a crucial thing. In fact, barring Peter Dickinson, all the composers we've just gone by have left us, while in the middle of the collaborative process. Now, George Rochberg would used to hound me because he knew that I have a slightly odd practice schedule, so I practiced between midnight and 3 every night. So he would work out, when I was touring, he would work out where I was in the world, and then he'd get my hotel number, and then he'd ring me at 2:30 in the morning to check I was still practicing. Which, this is serious, he once did it to me in China. It was in the middle of nowhere. But shortly before he died, he was going in for an operation. This is nothing more than this. He was so direct about this. He said he knew he was going to survive the operation. And he inadvertently, completely accidentally quoted Mark Twain. He rang me up and he said, Peter, I know I'm not going to get through this way. He said, I'm planning on making a lot less noise in the world now, which is the Twain. And he said, now it's your turn. And what's really interesting is what happens when someone does that to you. And I would say, and it's the same with a lot of my collaborators, that he's still ringing me up in the middle of the night. Now, I don't want you all to do clap your hands and believe in fairies, but I don't also want to present the workshop as being this kind of prosaic kind of thing. I think it is magic. It's absolutely extraordinary what can happen in a room when like-minded or even disparate-minded people work together on something they passionately believe in. And when we recorded a Hensar orchestra concerto after he died, I put together an ensemble. It was kind of mixed, so there were quite a lot of young players, and there were a number of players in the room who'd worked with Hans Werner. There was people like Chris Redgate, and Linda was playing. And there's a moment, about 15 minutes into that stage recording, where suddenly everybody who'd known him suddenly felt it come there. He was back in the room. It was absolutely tangible. And that's the thing I think we're looking for here. So, this is Jeremy Doyle Roberts. Now, I want to talk about time scales. Some composers work at extreme speed. Some work at absolutely geologically slow speeds. So, I got to know Jeremy in 2004 when he came down to a festival I was involved in running at Tates and Dives. And he was a pupil of Priya Rainier, whose music I played since I was in my late teens. And we got talking about Priya after one of the concerts, and he said, I'm thinking I might write a string quintet. Jeremy was notorious for writing things slowly. In 2012, he finished the first version of that quintet. We had public workshops, and then there were extensive revisions, and the final version got premiered, broadcast, and recorded in 2015. So from idea to realization was an 11-year trajectory of swapping ideas about art and music, and that was Jeremy's process. Anybody who had the chance to work with him knows this was one of the most refined minds you'd ever have the luck to be around as a musician. And that was how he worked. And after we made the recording of the quintet, he was very, very sick and everyone knew that he was dying. And so Jeremy was, if he was interested in one thing more than anything else, it was silence. So I took all the edit material. I took the first edit down to his lovely house in Sussex, and I put the disc on, and I said, look, every time there's a silence, I want you to conduct it, and I had a stopwatch with me. And so the very last workshop was actually on all the silences from this piece, which conducted, and so effectively, and the piece came out after he died. But that was really interesting, and it was no question for him that he knew that it was his last word. But the last word musically was the organisation of the musical element, which was certainly the most important to him. I wanted to skip ahead to Michael Finnessy because it enables me to expand a little bit on a part of the workshop process which I've alluded to, which is this relationship with other composers. With Michael is well known for his visionary completions of things, such as his Mozart Requiem completion. With us, and his work has been very, very much focused on the work of the Quetzal Quartet. He has approached this idea of the revision, the overwrite, in various ways. So, for instance, his second string quartet was, if you like, a retraversal of the Lark quartet, but, if you like, refiltered through his imagination. And there was a very interesting thing when we came up with the workshop process. He decided that every single moment that we encountered the music, he wasn't going to allow us to practice before the first rehearsal. There will be a camera and a microphone on from the very first time there was also a research project around this, saw and heard the music. So because he felt that the only way to get what he felt was how he described as a salty quality he wanted for the music, was for it to be encountered in real time, not mediated through us trying to get it right. He said, I don't want you to practice, I want you to be struggling in the public of the workshop with the camera on, because then we know what we want to hold on to. And then some of you will know his extraordinary encounter with Edvard Grieg, where he took the torso of Edvard Grieg's piano quintet movement, which Grieg just about got to the end of the exposition of the first movement, and he rolled it out in Grieg's language with some kind of very wonderfully, if you like, irreverent incursions of slaughter and things finding their way in. And he discovered when he did it that if he'd done this would, and if Grieg had ever written the other four movements, this would have been by far and away Grieg's longest piece. Because if you unroll the logical length of that exposition into a full piano quintet movement, it comes out as being 32 minutes long. You think how Grieg, he described his upset that he felt that all through Grieg's life that he was marginalized by being forced into small forms the whole time. And he said this was the chance he wanted to release Grieg into almost a Brucknerian scale. And then he did the most interesting thing, which was at the same time as writing this, we've been talking about kind of imitations of things, he had another traversal of the material, which was his traversal of the material, as it were, on the right-hand side of the table. So there's the Edvard Grieg piano quintet completed, and a piece he called his Grieg Quintet Sats, which is imagining if he was Grieg now, with his language, what would come out. So there's a kind of strange kind of interwoven relationship, which is not unlike the kind of thing you get. So obvious example was if you think of a Bach saraband, this one, for instance, which turns into as a doubler. Now, the normal way of talking about doublers, for instance, is their variations. I've never met a composer who believed that. I think it's more that so many composers have this thing that when they're holding one musical object in their mind, there are others which intersect the same material. Think of Stravinsky's traversal of the Petrushka material. I like the idea that they're kind of all in there as a kind of matrix overlaying each other, and they have different manifestations at different times. And that felt, to me, like it's the lesson we were getting from Michael. This was a very interesting thing, where for his 70th birthday, he decided that he wanted to play the Grieg pieces, which is very interesting because we'd played them with Roderick Chadwick, who's very fast fingers, to put it mildly. And then, of course, it's interesting, and then Michael had to say, well, I can't quite go there. So the piece was basically reconfigured with his, not old fingers, but more weighty approach. So that was kind of interesting enough. A number of piano-based composers have talked to me about the distance, which, not being a pianist at all, I can't really appreciate between writing a piece for the piano which they're going to play, which means often they might compose through the piano, or then having the horrific experience, which in one case from Michael Hirsch, he described where he'd written this piece for piano called The Vanishing Pavilions. It's a quite notorious 3-hour piece. And the pianist it was commissioned by elected not to play it. And so then he described, he'd written it away from the piano, going off to his studio one day and going to the first movement, and then coming back to his wife after 2 hours and going, what have I done? And realizing that he had to learn his way into something he, normally if he worked it for himself, this wouldn't have happened. The experience of the difficulty of getting to his own music. Here's somebody who absolutely loves coming and working at the dinner table. Nicola Benedetti is one of these people who often has a kind of image for a piece, which then she comes and talks about and then takes form. A few years ago, she had the idea of writing a piece based on the Grinling Gibbons panel of King David and St. Cecilia in Fairfax House in York. And so there were a whole series of meetings at various tables working out how we could do this. And what's interesting about Nicola, and this is going to be the case with quite a lot of composers, is there are some composers where you have to be given a clue as how to shape the material. And there are some composers for whom literally hurling yourself at the material will do it. And what's interesting about Nicola is that she's it's very discriminating here. She's very hard to please. I'm very interested in hard to please composers, because then when you finally find your way into them accepting what you're doing, you'll often find you're quite a long way from, if you like, accuracy, but there's something else that they're reaching out for. I'll give you an example. My all-time, most hard, I realise I'm going to have to use my glasses to find it. Here is, where's he gone? The composer that took me longest to get a smile out of. And if he's watching, I do apologise. Without doubt, Haflidy Hallgrimsson. So I started working with him when I was in my mid-20s. And Haflidy had been a virtuoso cellist. And early work with him was terrifying, because he'd literally tell you everything that's wrong with what you do technically. That's terrible. Why haven't you learned that? And what's wrong with the shifting then? There's a colour. There's no control at all. But I realised this was like a decade-long hazing. On and on and on and on. And I love the music so much, and if you do seek it out, because there's also some of the most beautiful scores imaginable, because he's also a graphic artist, and the CD cover and the frame pictures are his. And in 2005, I asked him, would he write a set of pieces based on Paul Klee, which I wanted to premiere at the Galleria Rufino Tamayo in Mexico City. So he wrote me a group of pieces. He finished them, and this is another long burn, he finished them in 2018. And the compositional process had been so long that he sent me the completed 2 books. I said, Haflidy, but there are 3 missing. And what had happened was, over the decade of writing, at various times he'd sent me pieces. He'd forgotten about them totally. I'd learned them. So there was one called Klee the Virtuoso, because Paul Klee, of course, was a violinist, plays the violin, and I sent it back to him. And he said, that's horrible, we can't possibly use that. Which is quite interesting, because I think we tend to think as players that, composers hold everything they've written in their minds like some kind of thing, it's all they can think about. But in the long run, it's the performer's job to hold it. Say, there are a number of very serious violinists in this room, and I wager that if, for instance, if you and I got together, we could, this is Cecily Ward, fabulous violinist over there, I'm really nervous talking to her actually. If we got together and said, okay, they've got Beethoven there, the two of us. Let's see who can write out the Spring Sonata from memory quickest. We're going to win. We spent more time working on the Spring Sonata than Beethoven did. We spent an entire lifetime working on it. For him, it's a month or two. It's gone. He's moved on. It's our job is to hold on to this stuff. And I think, this lesson of the composer forgetting was shocking when it happened. So, by the way, if anybody does want to butt in, please do, or ask any questions, because there are some composers for whom even getting to composing is, you basically have to push through so many ideas. Now, I've again known Robert Saxton for many, many years, and at the moment we're in the process of getting towards a set of pieces for solo violin based on some of my paintings. And I wanted to show you this. I took this at one of our never-ending meetings for tea or coffee, where he sees my sketchbook and he started to demonstrate how he was going to divide up the material for the metric modulations in the piece he's writing from it. He has very small hands, by the way. And what I love about it is this man who writes this unbelievably lyrical, passionate, virtuoso, terrifyingly difficult music, was kind of digging into the paper. And there's a moment from early work with him, recording actually, his wonderful first string quartet, which is called Songs, Dances and Ellipses, which is 29 minutes of horror, of terror. So we did a first take of it, and we decided to do 2 full takes of the whole piece, so we had trajectory before we did the whole sort of breaking it down. And after the first take, so we kind of really fallen over a bit, so there's 40 minutes after that we'd done the first take. He came out, he said, before you do that one, I just need to have a word with Neil. He said, that first phrase, can you make, he said, what I want to say is that first phrase, could it be that shape as opposed to that shape? And I've seen him do this many times. He knows that if he adjusts the angle of something right at the beginning of the piece, this will have this massive result about 16 minutes later. Most Robert Saxton chamber pieces end with a moment, his quartets all end with a moment where he throws the first violinist off the edge of a cliff. They always do. There's always a moment where I'm screaming in terror. And this meant that as opposed to screaming in terror just coming down, I don't know, Beachy Head, this was Everest at this point, because he knew that just by adjusting that, and that's the craft which I find really, really amazing and exciting. This knowledge of the thing which is beyond me as a mere player, if you like, is knowing how just to move something around. What I was going to get to, which I didn't complete with regard to my kvetching about Sibelius, was if I hold up 2 scores here. So let's put Widmer away. Let's take 2 marvelous scores. This is the score of a piece by the wonderful Czech composer Pavel Novak, 25 caprices on the theme of Janáček's first string quartet. I challenge any musician not to get excited by that, especially because when it arrived, it had this wonderful flap because he'd recomposed it. Now, anybody who knows the manuscript of Beethoven's Opus 30 No. 2 Sonata will know that that has exactly the same thing in the scherzo, where Beethoven decided to insert an extra 5 bars in the da 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 pa pa pi da da, the wonderful trio. And so to look at that, I'm not even good at suggestions. So there's that kind of handwriting. And then here is the manuscript of the second piece, which Michael Hirsch wrote for me. So his In the Snowy Margins, which is a very particular kind of thing. And if I put it alongside something like this, well, that's got my writing on it. So the colours are me, I'm sorry. So this is the handwriting of the Cypriot composer, Avis Samutis. Now I chose 3 things which were all kind of febrile and quivering, but even at a distance you can see that there is the difference between these things. That, I'm afraid, is quite difficult to preserve if you only see that printed. Now, I appreciate there's plenty of people who work directly into the computer, but for me, on top of that, there's another thing. and it's something which I know as being an artist myself and spending a lot of time around graphic artists, which is, if you think of a line, just one line drawn by Egon Schiele from an amazing figure, for instance. Now think of a line from, say, David Hockney's portrait of W.H. Auden, for instance. Or put it next to Cocteau's portrait of Stravinsky, right? Which is, Hockney clearly knows well. Go close into those lines. These, without doubt, you've got three of the greatest draftspeople ever to hold a pen or a pencil or a piece of charcoal. Technique that Vasari would celebrate. But what's fantastic about it is that they can't hold the pen or the pencil without betraying what's going on inside them. What Eliot called the circulation of the lymph. It's pulsing through them. And because I'm trying to work out in every particular how to produce timbre. And so many times the answer to that comes from either the way that the composer approaches the score, the manuscript score, or in some cases, the relationship a composer would have had with a great engraver, or in a very narrow number of cases, the ability they have with the program. I could give you name about 10 composers now who are able to use the program so well that it is deeply expressive. But as a violinist, where everything is up for grabs, we have no frets, we have everything is going to be out of tune, everything is different. We're looking for clues as to, and there's no question. There's an analogy between that going onto the paper and the bow going onto the string. You have to be sort of maybe quite insensitive not to see it. Sometimes I find myself back to it. All right. I want to now talk about other ways that one can use the workshop. The Nashville-based composer Michael Rhodes is very basically not known in this country, but I was introduced to him by George Rochberg, and we became very close friends. And what's interesting about Michael is that he is very much an artistic and musical omnivore. And we've experimented with various different ways of having the workshop, from the basic kind of thing of setting up in the foyer, some concert hall and playing a piece to each other and arguing about it, or something he came up with, which was, he suggested that we should write a set of pieces together which was directly informed by time spent in a landscape and time walking. So in 2014, 2015, we rented a small cottage on Dartmoor, and each day we would go and walk and talk and walk and talk, and each day come back to the cottage and then set up the workshop on the table. And then he'd write and I'd record something, and some of my drawings found their way into there. In fact, the cover of the resulting CD was one of the drawings I did as part of the project. And some really amazing things happened, and this is where the internet was just fantastic. So, because I'm quite active online, I was writing about the workshop each night. And one morning, about 3 days into the project, there were 2 emails come to my website. One was from a poet in Bangladesh who said, he was so excited, did he mind if I set some of the words, he'd reconfigured some of the words we'd written the day before and turned them into a poem. And the other was from a class full of school children in Brazil who said they were following our project as a music assignment for the whole week. So each day they were following it and they were doing paintings and drawings about it. So they found their way into the project as well. And I think that we're in a, I don't want to say unique situation now, but we're now in a situation where on a daily basis, and we have to ask ourselves as artists whether we want to engage with this or not engage with it, we can communicate what is going on to our audience, to each other. And there is such a lot, in my experience, there's such a lot of extraordinary things coming from composers, just to cite the most narrow thing right now, that I could basically rave about this 3 or 4 times a day and still not run out of material to talk to people. Not saying, not trying to draw attention that I'm doing. The fact is that, for instance, last night, 2 days before, a new piece had come in from from Michael, which is linked to a project I'm doing based around Pierre Rode's ornamented Stradivari, which is in the Ashmolean at the moment. So he'd written the first centerpiece I've asked for that. And coincidentally, Gregory Rose had sent me a beautiful piece in memoriam to Joe Horowitz. And so last night I set up, I knew I wouldn't sleep because I was very excited about this, so I thought I might as well practice it. So I set my workbench up, and I first of all I learned Michael's piece, and then I learned Joe's piece. I call it Joe's piece and Gregory's piece. And it was kind of fantastic. There couldn't be more chalk and cheese. There's nothing more disparate than these two composers. But having them talking to each other on the workbench was very similar to what I experienced when I think about what happens when we think about the great collaborations of the past. So what are they? If we're violinists, I'm a violinist, so I just talked about violins. So the great collaborations, the obvious ones we're going to be thinking about are obviously Joseph Joachim, and initially with Robert and Clara Schumann, and when he was very young with Mendelssohn. The most important most successful instrumental performance ever given in London was October the 31st, 1844, when the 12-year-old Joseph Joachim stood on stage and gave the first successful public performance of the Beethoven Violin Concerto with his own cadenzas, conducted by Felix Mendelssohn at the Royal Philharmonic Society. A performance so successful that everybody forgot to mention it was a child. He literally resurrected a piece which had been played, and had been played in the UK. It wasn't forgotten, but was regarded as being completely intractable. Literally raised it. And for the next 60 years, he kept coming back to London. Listen to the recordings he made 60 years later of Bach, and challenge yourself to think if you can ever get anywhere close to that. But the amazing thing about Joachim is he offers this model, he called it servant of art, that his relationship to Bach, which he brought onto the concert stage. Bach was being played plenty, but it was being played in salon environments. He brings it out there. He completes the job which Felix Mendelssohn had started with the Method Passion in 1829. Brings solo Bach out, sets the stage, which means Casals can continue to work in the 20th century. He does that. But at the same moment, he finds common cause between that and the work that he does, first of all, with Mendelssohn. The original idea for the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto was it was going to be for him. That's the reason for the high E's, because Mendelssohn was very excited by the leaping high E's in the Ernst Concerto, which Joachim had played with him. Then you have the extraordinary Schumann pieces, particularly the Clara Schumann Drei Romanzen, which are her penultimate work, written nearly 50 years before she died. And then you have the amazing collaboration with Brahms, which fractures, of course. But I'm looking for how can I get into that. We do have a little bit of a documentation of how Brahms wrote with Joachim. We know that their way of working together was to get together, in particular on summer holidays, and play sonatas together, particularly arrangements of Haydn string quartets as piano sonatas. There is one workshop I would have liked to have been in, though, which is the workshop which was set up in Switzerland between Tchaikovsky and the violinist for whom he wrote the violin concerto, Kotek. Think about what they did. They played through recently published pieces, or pieces recently published in Russia anyway. One of them, which gave them the idea for the placing of the cadenza in the concerto before the recap, was the Mendelssohn Concerto. And the other one, which nobody seems to notice, is this. The Lala Symphony of Spano, which became and of course, Brahms would include homage to Joachim's Bach playing in the second subject of the Brahms Violin Concerto is, particularly in the recapitulation, Joachim playing the chaconne. It's explicit. It's effectively gives you a wonderful performance practice indication of how he would have played the chaconne, which of course he never had the chance to record. So at every stage, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that kind of intersection. Now I'm aware that we've only got a few more minutes, so it would be great if there are any questions, because I can go on talking about my friends and this so we're out of time. Okay, so but if anyone wants to ask anything, that's great, but
and the tactile sort of artisan approach to composition in the way that I feel that so many composers I admire perform when they're composing.
That's lovely, yes.
And I wondered whether you, in part of your collaboration, I mean, it may probably totally inconvenient for you at the time, whether you watched people compose, and that helps.
Yes, because I spent a lot of time with composers. I've also had composers, one thing to do, if you have composers staying with you and they might be blocked, don't leave material out. I did have an occasion with composer X, where a few years later, playing a new quintet of theirs, I said, that's awfully familiar. He said, well, I couldn't get from that bar to that bar, and you'd left that clearly unusable with a string quartet, which you'd written, so I thought you weren't using it. But spending time, I think it's important that we take time to spend time together enough that we can do things. So composition is almost as bone-numbingly boring as violin practice. And I'm actually passionate about the fact that practice should be as slow a process as composing, as labour-intensive, because what we're trying to do is get close to the nightmare you guys have to go through to get, especially in fast music. You know, if you do 30 minutes of fast music, you know, how long is that going to take? So I agree with you totally. A respect for how long that takes, also in terms of finding the tactus and the shape for it, and watching it happen. I think it's really, you know, and I've actually got to bits where I've got composers have drawn a shape onto my music to indicate the shape. So like an intermediary process, performance on the score with a pencil to, like Beethoven shaped his slurs to shape the music in a graphic kind of way. So I think that's very exciting. I want to do it more actually, I think. Anything else? Yes?
Just a question, and I've been thinking about collaboration a little bit, but I wonder if there's, you told us about only specific, wonderful things that can happen in the workshop. Is there a point where you would say, after hearing about it further, what's the point at which a composer will push you to think these, I'm not going to do that anymore? And what would you recommend kind of, for people who start collaborating?
That's a semi-permeable membrane, really, isn't it? Sometimes really, so for instance, I'll give you an example of how that can be useful. So the piece which Nigel Clarke wrote for me, which was our first big solo piece, is a piece called Pernambuco, which is a piece I've played so many times, he's asked me to stop telling him, because it just looks embarrassing on the website. I think I'm way past 300 performances of that, right? We're in the workshop together, so we got the violin with about really complicated scordatura, and I got really angry with him. I said, for goodness sake, no! And he said, what's that? So it ended, that became, so what's it good? So the frustration boiled over. I actually got very angry with him. But I think it's a shame if we don't get close to those places. You know, so it's like the old saying about the economics is the third rail of politics. That's because that's where all the power is. You know, that's those places. So I'm not advising you to make trouble, but actually you really should. You know, it's where rock and roll history is really useful. You know, if you go and you can, I really wish we had great classical music journalism like rock and roll journalism of the 1970s, where the process was what was interesting. You know, and you know, yeah, I know it's people breaking televisions and everything, but there's something in that. You know, we tend to be a little bit milksop, I think. Yeah.
How, when you collaborate in a workshop situation, before you start working together, is there a sense of a kind of meeting in the middle of what either of your intentions are, or is it very much you are at the service of the composer, and that's the agreement in the way that you're at the service of the
I can answer that with back to the last story I'm going to tell. So, during lockdown, where I made the mistake of making myself very available and kind of got deluged with compositions, which I'm still trying to catch up with, which is marvellous. So, Nigel Clarke and I have, I'll just give so you know who we're talking about. He and I have been working together since we were both very, very young. This resulted in a small number of pieces, not a huge number of pieces. So we started talking about things, and I said to him, because this is about ownership, I said, what about the prophecies of Merlin? He said, what are you talking about? And previously we'd done a violin concerto based on Milton and things. So we started talking about the whole thing of when Merlin stands on the cliffs of Dover and kind of hurls insults across the channel. Sorry, I didn't wind this up. Here we are. Don't play. Here we go. So now, 2 years after that conversation began, we have a 5-movement symphony for violin and orchestra. It is 50 minutes long. We're recording it with the Austrian Radio Orchestra in September. Right? But at every point, he wanted me to step all over his land. So this is the last piece of advice I want to give players. As a player, be ready to do the donkey work for a composer. If you want to have rest on the plane, don't let a composer sit next to you, because what you want them to do is to hand them a score and say, find the mistakes. Could be a proofreader for composers. So with Nigel, my work goes all the way from, let's do the piece, fighting about it, to he will come over and we'll sit with the scores there, this 5 huge scores. We have proofread every bar of that, and because it's in 50 separate parts. But I think that's an answer to you, is that actually God is in the detail. God is in the getting involved in the absolute nightmare of the detail and making sure everything is right in the score. Just as much as it is in publishing. So once you've got into that, and that's what getting your hands dirty really means. And then it's like a Gyra-like relationship. You know, the two things, it's completely his piece. And the shared endeavour, I think some musicians are a little bit coy about getting involved with moving the chairs. My mother always says that if somebody thinks they're too important to move a chair, they're already dead. And I kind of think that is what a working relationship is. We're doing that. You know, we've got to make sure that we respect each other enough to not say there's any part of the thing which we won't help with. And also make sure you feed each other. You know, coffee, good bottle of wine, I'm a cook, make sure we can look after each other in that way. And I think that's something, there's a tendency for people not to get involved in. Make sure we use the home as a kind of, literally a place where ideas can grow. So, overlap. Yes?
Hello, it's wonderful, thank you. I could ask lots of questions, but I have one from Gavin Waite, who's joining us on Zoom.
Hello there.
So, Gavin says, thank you for the fascinating insight into your different collaborative experiences. My question is, do you ever find yourself knowingly using ideas or experience drawn from your collaboration with other composers when working with a composer? Whereby we get composer influencing composer with you as a kind of dynamic conduit. This idea of hidden influence might change the way we understand the work with some of the composers you've worked with. And then he writes, possibly along the lines of Joachim's influence on Brahms.
That's a very nice idea. The answer is yes, no. So often it will be, for instance, if a composer and I come up with a technical kind of gambit or a notation, I might show that notation to somebody else. The solution, you know, for instance, Mihailo Trantofolowski and I discovered last week that if you play here, and in a recording session, and pizzicato the G, the violin makes a B flat. I thought there was something wrong with the Amati. I went home, tried it on 6 violins at home, and any violin. We didn't know this. I'm telling everybody now. So, but here's the thing. I can honestly, hand on heart, say that I don't use the same sounds or technique for one composer that I use for another. Just as much as, imagine yourself, if I could play the piano, imagine playing the Schubert B flat sonata, which I'd love to play. And then I'm going to play the Hammer clavier. There's basically nothing in common between we're in the same era. And I think that's not difficult to do. It's like there are walls there. So the answer is, I don't think I've ever had the experience of musical material going across, but it's technical material.
Can I ask a question for me then that follows on
Yeah.
from that? Do you think composers approach you because there's something distinctive that you bring to collaboration? Do you think that they think, we want to work with musicians because of?
I think you probably approach them because they're probably mad. No, I don't know. It's quite often someone will say to me, "Oh, what you do is so individual or distinctive." I'm not. I'm just doing the only thing I know how to do. And when someone says you're doing something individual or original, I don't know what they're talking about. I'm quite limited in some ways, and all I know is how to respond to the person in front of me and how to clear out what else is going on. So I'm very good at forgetting stuff, and I think that's quite important. I've never asked the question why. I don't approach many people myself now. That is true. When in the past I probably would have done. But the one thing is I think the most important thing. Okay, this is where I'm going to finish. The most important thing, I've talked about old artists. The most important thing as an older person now is young composers. I do not use the word student musician. I do not use the word student composer. I will never give a masterclass. I don't believe in this rubbish. We're all working on the same bit of rock. And my feeling is the longer an older artist can just stay ahead of the tidal wave of what young artists are doing, just ride that wave, I'm happy to be subsumed by it. But the most I learn is always from the young composers. That's where the real energy and excitement is. And there's nothing more exciting than someone bringing me their first piece. And that kind of, it's not because it's fresh, that would be condescending. The idea of something which is like a newly split piece of granite. That is incredible. And that's the joy for me.
I just wanted to point out, if anyone does have any more questions, he doesn't actually finish quite yet. It's traditional for our guest speaker to go to the bar, and Peter will be invited to the bar to do so. In fact, he so expertly ran everything, we didn't even need to have anyone field the questions. It was an absolutely thrilling presentation. You may not have noticed, but as he was kind of skipping through all these slides, I heard the gasps, because we just saw the sheer amount of work and collaborations. And I have to tell you all, this is just skimming, the top of an iceberg. There's this huge amount of depth underneath. And it was wonderful to have you mention Pernambuco. I have, including in this room, assessed about 20 presentations by violinists here on the work Pernambuco and on the performance challenges, and and it's just, I think, part of that legacy. And earlier you were working with her violinists, and including contemporary music, including Charlotte, of course, playing a piece by a very young composer that she had researched herself. And it's just wonderful to hear you talk about these collaborations and how they clearly inspire you. And I think it's safe to say they've inspired all of us. So can I just say thanks again from all of us for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.